Hello, and welcome back to tonight's storytelling journey. Tonight, we will step into the story of King Solomon, the king remembered as the wisest ruler of Israel, the man who built the first temple, the one whose understanding drew distant nations to come and listen. But behind that radiance, there was a darkness that moved very slowly, very quietly, like a small crack running beneath the stone floor of the palace. This is not only the story of 1,000 wives. This is the story of an ancient warning in the Bible, a warning given to every king of Israel. Do not accumulate too many horses. Do not gather too much silver and gold. Do not take too many wives, so that the heart will not be pulled away from the path of righteousness. Before we begin, gently let me know where you are listening to this story from, and what time it is where you are sitting right now. And what is frightening is that, in Solomon's life, those lines of warning seem to appear one after another, little by little, choice by choice, compromise by compromise. So how did a king who began with a prayer for wisdom come to a place where he shook an entire kingdom? Take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, and together, let us open the old scroll of time. Before we step into Solomon's palace, before the golden light of Jerusalem blazes beneath the eastern sun, before the chariots, the envoys, the royal marriages, and the rumors of his wisdom spread far into strange lands, there was something much quieter already waiting. It was not a throne, nor was it the cheering of the people on the day a king was crowned. It was a warning placed within the law of Israel, lying like a solemn line among the commandments, the statutes, and the teachings that the people were to remember as they entered the life of a nation set apart. That warning did not name Solomon. It did not point to one specific king. It did not say that one day a son of David would stand at the summit of power and allow his heart to be divided. But when Solomon's story begins to unfold, and when people look back at those ancient lines, the feeling is strangely haunting. It is as if a lamp had already been lit long before the darkness came. In the book of Deuteronomy, there is a passage that speaks of the day when the people of Israel would desire a king to rule over them. This is remarkable, because when those words were given, Israel was not yet a kingdom like the nations around them. They were not defined first by palaces or armies, but by a covenant with God. They were a people who had passed through the sea, who had walked through the wilderness, who had lived by manna, who had learned to hear the voice of command not from a human throne, but from God himself amid cloud and fire. And yet the Bible understands the human heart very well. A day would come when the people would look toward the nations around them. They would see armies led by kings. They would see palaces, courts, banners, solemn ceremonies, and thrones raised high above everyone else. And then, in their hearts, a very familiar desire would begin to form. We also want a king like the other nations. The warning in Deuteronomy does not completely deny that possibility, but it draws a boundary. If Israel has a king, that king must not be like the kings of foreign nations. If there is a throne in Israel, that throne must not stand higher than the law of God. If a man is placed over the people to rule them, he must not forget that he too is only a man under the authority of the Lord. That is what makes this passage so profound. The Bible is not concerned only with who sits on the throne. The Bible is concerned with what rules the heart of the one who sits there. A king may wear a robe, bear a crown, and hold authority over fortresses and armies. But if his heart is drawn away by power, by fear, by ambition, or by the admiration of the world, then that throne will no longer be a place from which the people are served. It will become a place where a man lifts himself too high, until he can no longer hear the warning beneath him. That is why the law speaks so clearly. The king must be the one chosen by God. He must not be a foreigner who does not belong to his own people. This is not only a matter of bloodline or politics, it is also a matter of identity. The king of Israel must not rule like someone standing outside the covenant. He must understand the memory of his people. He must know that they were once slaves in Egypt. He must know that they were delivered not by the strength of war horses, but by the mighty arm of God. He must know that the land, the harvests, the cities, and the future of Israel are not the private property of any dynasty. Then the first warning sounds, brief but heavy. The king must not accumulate many horses for himself. To us today, that image may pass by quickly, but in the ancient world, a horse was not merely an animal. A horse meant speed, war, strength, the sign of a kingdom seeking to stand on the same level as empires. Chariots drawn by horses could make the ground tremble. A troop of horsemen moving across the plain could terrify small cities. The sound of hooves was not only the sound of warfare, but the sound of human power, trusting that it could defend itself with iron, with wheels, and with trained armies. But Israel was not born that way. In their sacred memory, the sea had opened not because they had more chariots than Pharaoh. They had survived in the wilderness not because they had greater storehouses than other peoples. They endured because God had led them, and because of that, an Israelite king, even if he needed to organize the nation, even if he needed to protect the people, was not allowed to let military strength become the place where his heart found refuge. So the warning about horses was not merely a warning about an arsenal, it was a warning about trust. What will a king trust when night falls? When the borders are threatened? When great nations move in the distance? When advisors whisper that only more horses, more chariots, more alliances, more strength can preserve peace? And immediately after that, the law goes even deeper. The king must not cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire more horses. Egypt, that name alone was enough to make Israel's memory tremble. Egypt was not simply a powerful nation to the south. Egypt was the place where their ancestors had once been oppressed. It was the place where the groaning of slaves had once risen among mud, straw, and bricks. It was the place where Pharaoh once believed he had the right to hold a people in chains forever. And it was also the place where God revealed that no earthly throne can stand when he chooses to deliver his people. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is not that people openly rebel against their sacred past. The greater danger is that they slowly become familiar with the very things that once bound them, and then call it reality, strategy, necessity, or simply normal. The second warning moves into an even deeper place. The king must not have many wives, so that his heart will not be turned aside. This sentence will become especially important in the story of Solomon. But in this chapter, let us pause before its original meaning. In the world of ancient kings, royal marriage was often not merely about love. It could be an alliance between two courts, a sign of peace between two territories, a pledge between different powers. When a king married a foreign princess, he did not merely bring a woman into his palace. He might also bring in a political relationship, a system of influence, a religious memory, a diplomatic pressure, and the quiet presence of the gods worshipped by that people. The law does not explain this at length. It speaks simply of the heart, so that the heart will not be turned aside. How striking it is that, among the instructions for a king, the Bible does not speak only about thrones, military power, or wealth. It speaks of the heart, because in the biblical vision, the outer kingdom often follows the inner kingdom. If the king's heart is upright, the people have a chance to be led in reverence. If the king's heart is scattered, the whole land may gradually follow that scattering. A heart pulled in many directions may not break at once. It only drifts a little, then a little more, until what once stood at the center is no longer the center. The third warning concerns silver and gold. The king must not accumulate too much silver and gold for himself. Once again, the Bible does not treat material wealth as evil in itself. Gold can be used in a holy place. Silver can serve the work of the people. Prosperity can be a blessing. But when silver and gold become a storehouse for the king's ego, when wealth is gathered to glorify the throne more than to reflect righteousness, then gold is no longer merely a precious metal. It becomes a kind of light that can blind the human soul. Gold is beautiful under the lamp, but there are things that shine so brightly on the outside that they easily hide the darkness within. The richer a king becomes, the more he is tempted to believe he is secure. The more splendid a court becomes, the more it is tempted to believe that splendor is proof of righteousness. But the law of Israel does not measure a king by the height of his palace or the weight of his treasury. It measures him by his humility before God. And then, after all the things the king must not do, the law gives the one thing he must do. When he sits on the throne, he must write for himself a copy of the law, not to store it away in a treasury, not to hand it to the priests so they can read it in his place, not to use it in great ceremonies and then forget it afterward. He must keep that law with him and read it all the days of his life. Picture that scene slowly. A king sits inside his palace. Outside, soldiers stand guard, courtiers wait for orders, envoys from distant lands come to offer greetings. There are treasures, rituals, and the authority to command thousands of people. But before him lies a scroll, and every day he must bow down and read. Not the people reading to praise the king, but the king reading the law so he will remember that he is not the absolute master of the people. He must read in order to learn the fear of the Lord. He must read in order to obey every word of the law. He must read so that his heart will not lift itself above his brothers. That sentence is beautiful and also severe. The king must not exalt himself above his brothers. Among other nations, kings often stood far above the people. The king was an image of power, sometimes almost divine. But in Israel, the king, though anointed and honored, must never forget that he stands among his brothers. He does not own the people. He serves the people under God. This is the heart of the warning. The issue is not only horses, wives, or gold. Those things are only signs. The deeper question is this: does the king still remember who he is before God? If he forgets, horses will become his refuge, gold will become his pride, marriage will become an instrument of power. The throne will become a mirror in which he sees his own greatness instead of his responsibility. And when that happens, collapse often does not arrive at once like a storm. It comes like night mist seeping into stone, softly, slowly, almost unnoticed, until one day the cracks are everywhere. So the first chapter of Solomon's story does not truly begin with Solomon. It begins with a question placed before every king of Israel. Can you sit on the throne and still bow before the law of God? Can you possess power without being swallowed by power? Can you live amid wealth without allowing silver and gold to become the measure of your soul? Can you move among alliances, praises, diplomatic ceremonies, and the beauty of the royal court, and still keep your heart whole? Those questions lay quietly within the law. Across many generations, they stood like stones placed beside the road, making no noise, forcing no one to look, yet always remaining there. They waited for the day a nation would ask for a king. They waited for the day a throne would be raised. They waited for the day a great king would appear, to see whether that greatness would still know how to fear the Lord. And then, in the flow of biblical history, Israel truly entered the age of kings. There were battles, there were songs, there were promises given to the house of David, there were cities taken, there was Jerusalem, the city that would become the center of so many hopes and tears. And from within that flow, at last, a young king would appear, a man who did not begin with arrogance, but with a deeply humble prayer, a man who would be remembered for wisdom beyond the people of his time, a man who would build things so radiant that distant nations would marvel. But before that light burst forth, the warning was already there, like a small lamp placed in a dark room, like a whisper beneath the music of the royal court, like the words on a scroll that a king must read all the days of his life. So he would not forget that the throne is not a place where a human being is allowed to lose his soul. Tonight, as we stand at the threshold of Solomon's story, let us keep that warning in our hearts, for from this point on, every light in his life will cast a shadow beside it. Every success will bring a test. Every gift given to him will require a heart humble enough to carry it. And perhaps that is why this story still leaves people silent after thousands of years. Not because Solomon was a distant king from ancient history, but because the warning given to him, in truth, also touches every human being. Each of us accumulates something. Some accumulate power, some accumulate recognition, some accumulate relationships that may pull the heart far away. Some accumulate beautiful things until they forget to ask where those things are leading them. And just like the kings of old, what matters most is not only what we hold in our hands, it is what is holding our hearts. That is where the story begins. Not in the sound of horse hooves, not in the gleam of gold, not in a palace filled with people, but in a forgotten warning, resting quietly on the pages of Scripture, waiting for the day it would be seen again beneath the shadow of a throne. Now, before us, there is Jerusalem. There is the throne of David. There are the stone corridors of the palace. There is the last breath of an old reign, as the king who had once fought, sung, wept, sinned, and repented was nearing the final days of his life. David was old. The kingdom of Israel he would leave behind was no longer a loose gathering of tribes surrounded by danger. It had fortresses. It had an army. It had a capital. It had the memory of victories. It had a sacred promise placed upon the house of David. But the greater a kingdom becomes, the longer its shadow grows. And within that shadow, there are always whispers. When a king begins to weaken, the throne becomes something many eyes notice even before it is truly empty. In the final days of David's life, Adonijah, another of his sons, exalted himself and tried to seize the kingship. The scene was not loud like a battle on an open plain, but it was tense like a tightened string inside the palace. Some followed Adonijah. Some remained silent. Some waited to see which way the wind would blow. Feasts, blessings, and political calculations began to appear like shadowed figures passing through lamplight. In that moment, Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan stepped into the story. They did not enter as passing secondary figures. They entered as people preserving a promise from being buried beneath human ambition. Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, came before David. Nathan, the prophet who had once confronted David in the darkest hours of his life, also spoke. And the promise concerning Solomon was brought back into memory. A king growing old was called back to his final responsibility. David gave the command. Solomon was taken down to Gihon. He was anointed king. The trumpet sounded. The people rejoiced. And in that moment, a new chapter of Israel began. But listen very slowly. Solomon did not step onto the throne on a morning that was completely clear. He stepped onto it amid the echoes of a struggle for power, amid the memory of a family marked by many wounds, amid a kingdom built through war, blood, tears, and prayer. The throne he received was not merely a seat of honor. It was a burden placed upon the shoulders of someone still very young, compared with the depth of history he now had to carry. Perhaps that is what makes Solomon's early steps so remarkable. He did not begin with the roar of someone trying to prove his power. He did not come forward as a man who believed the throne existed to serve him. In the opening pages of his reign, the Bible shows us a Solomon who still trembled before responsibility. A Solomon still standing in David's shadow. A Solomon who understood that this nation was not his private possession. After his throne was secured, Solomon began to rule. His first actions reveal a king trying to strengthen the kingdom that had just been handed to him. There were political decisions. There were necessary arrangements. There were remnants from David's time that had to be dealt with. A new reign cannot be born in a vacuum. It must pass through old stories, old dangers, old oaths, and old enmities that have not yet fallen asleep. But in the midst of all these things, there is one moment that separates itself from the noise of the court. A moment that takes Solomon beyond the walls of Jerusalem and brings him to Gibeon. Gibeon was an important high place at that time, before the temple was built in Jerusalem. The people of Israel were still offering sacrifices at the high places. This is a detail that must be heard with care. The Bible shows that Solomon loved the Lord and walked in the statutes of David, his father. Yet it also records that he still sacrificed at the high places. Even in the most beautiful part of the story, there remains a very thin outline of incompleteness. And it was there, at Gibeon, in the night, that the decisive moment came. Picture the scene: not a radiant Jerusalem, not a court filled with servants and officials, not a throne surrounded by voices of praise. Only an ancient night, when the air over the high place had grown still, when the sacrificial fire had begun to fade, when the last trails of smoke rose and dissolved into the darkness. A young king lay down after the long rituals. Above him was the wide sky. Beneath him was the land of a people he had just been entrusted to lead. And in a dream, God came to him. The question placed before him was simple, yet profoundly deep. Ask what I shall give you. There are moments in a human life when a single question is enough to reveal the whole heart. When a person is allowed to ask, what is truly feared, truly desired, and truly worshipped often comes into the open. A newly crowned king could ask for many things. He could ask for long life, because the throne often comes with the fear of death. He could ask for wealth, because gold and silver make a court more splendid. He could ask for the lives of his enemies, because anyone newly placed on a throne knows that there are still people nearby who do not want him to stand secure. But Solomon did not ask for those things. He looked back at David, the father who had gone before him. He saw the mercy God had shown to the house of David. He recognized that he was only a young man, not knowing how to go out or come in before such a great people. And then he asked for a listening heart, so that he could judge the people, and so that he could discern between good and evil. That was the request that made Solomon's name, not because it sounded noble on the lips of a king, but because it showed that, in that moment, Solomon understood the true nature of kingship. To rule is not only to command. To rule is to listen, to judge, to carry the pain of others into one's own consideration, to know that behind every case, every dispute, every cry for justice, there are real human lives. Solomon did not ask for a sharper sword. He asked for a brighter heart. And the Bible says that this request pleased God, because Solomon did not ask for long life for himself. He did not ask for riches for himself. He did not ask for the lives of his enemies. He asked for understanding in order to administer justice. And because of this, God gave him what he had asked for. Wisdom and understanding were placed upon his life in such a way that his name would later reach beyond the borders of Israel. But not only that, he was also given what he had not asked for, riches and honor, so that, in his days, no king would be like him. This is one of the most radiant moments in Solomon's life. But if we listen deeply, we will hear that this moment is not only about the gift God gave, it is also about what a king must continue to keep. Wisdom is not a crown placed on the head that can never fall. It is more like a lamp that must be fed by reverence, humility, faithfulness, and the practice of listening every day. A person can be given wisdom and still must choose to live wisely. A person can begin rightly and still must continue to walk rightly. After the dream at Gibeon, Solomon returned to Jerusalem. He stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, offered sacrifices, and held a feast for all his servants. That image is like a small circle closing, from the high place of Gibeon back to the center of Israel's hope, from a private dream back to public responsibility, from a prayer in the night back to the daylight life of a kingdom. And very soon, that wisdom was tested. The story of the two women who came before Solomon is one of the most famous scenes in the Bible. It does not take place on a battlefield. There is no army, no foreign kings, no gold and silver, no procession of envoys. There are only two women, one living child, one dead child, and a grief that no one in the court could touch if they looked only with ordinary eyes. The two women lived in the same house. Both gave birth. One child died in the night. Then the dispute broke out. One woman said the living child was hers. The other said the same. There were no clear witnesses, no easy evidence, only word against word, tears against tears, and a tiny child lying between two cries. Imagine the hall in that moment. The officials may have stood in silence. The servants may have held their breath. A matter that seemed to belong to the poor. Hidden corners of life was brought before the throne, and Solomon, the king who had just asked for a listening heart, now had to prove that his request was not only beautiful inside a dream. He listened. Then he gave a test that made the entire room grow cold. He ordered that a sword be brought and said that the living child should be divided in two, with half given to one woman and half to the other. That was not cruelty. It was a blade placed against the heart of the truth, because the true mother could not bear to see her child killed, even if it meant losing the child to another. True love does not need to possess at any cost. True love is willing to suffer so that the child may live. And that is exactly what happened. One woman immediately pleaded that the child be given to the other, as long as he might live. The other accepted the division. In that moment, the truth appeared, not through outward evidence, but through the depth of a mother's love. Solomon saw it. He gave the child to the true mother. The story spread throughout Israel. The people heard of that judgment and feared the king, because they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. This is the image of Solomon before his fall, a king who could sit on a throne and still hear the cries of the lowly, a king concerned not only with the strategies of great nations, but also with the pain inside a small house, a king who could use sharpness not to display power, but to protect life. If Solomon's story ended here, he would appear as an almost perfect symbol of wisdom. But the Bible rarely tells the story of human beings as if they were stone statues. The Bible tells human beings as they truly are, with light and shadow, with beautiful moments and with cracks no one has yet noticed, even within the chapters that speak of Solomon's good beginning. There are very small details that make the listener remember the warning from the previous chapter. One of them is the alliance with Pharaoh of Egypt and the marriage to Pharaoh's daughter. That detail appears early in Solomon's reign. It is not immediately presented as a disaster. On the surface, it could be seen as a wise diplomatic move. Egypt was a major power. A royal marriage could strengthen peace, create prestige, and open the way for political relations. For a young king seeking to stabilize the kingdom, this could look like practical wisdom. But the listener already knows what the story is quietly holding in the shadows. In the warning given to Israel's king, Egypt is not an ordinary name. Egypt is the old land of slavery, the memory of chains, the place from which Israel had been drawn out by the power of God. And though this early detail in Solomon's reign is not yet the center of his fall, it is like a small streak of cloud on the horizon, only small, but enough to make anyone who has read the law grow quiet. In addition, the Bible also records that Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David, his father, only that he still sacrificed at the high places. That sentence is remarkable. It does not deny Solomon's real love for God, nor does it erase the wisdom that was given to him. But it leaves behind the phrase, "only that," like a thin opening in a beautiful wall. There are only that moments in a human life that seem very small at first. A habit that has not yet been brought under the light. A compromise still considered temporary. A gray area that has not yet been named correctly. An exception we think will not affect the whole path. But in the biblical story, such small things often do not remain small. They can grow quietly together with power, with age, with success, until one day they become doors through which larger things enter. So this chapter is not the chapter of Solomon's judgment. This is the chapter in which we see the beauty of his beginning. A young king who knew he needed God. A man who did not ask for what would make him great in the eyes of the world, but for what would help him serve the people. A man given wisdom so profound that justice could emerge from a case that seemed impossible to solve. A man whom the people looked upon and recognized that something from God was present in his judgment. And yet, at the same time, this chapter is also where we learn how to listen to the very small sounds within the story. Because great tragedy often does not begin with thunder. It begins like a distant sound. A footstep in the corridor. A choice that seems reasonable. An alliance considered necessary. A high place still left standing. A small detail on the page of Scripture that, if we read too quickly, we may pass over. Solomon before his fall is the Solomon most worthy of respect, and also the Solomon who makes the listener grieve the most, because he did not begin in darkness. He began in light. He did not begin by despising God. He began with a prayer. He did not begin with a closed heart. He began with a listening heart. That is why his story is not only a warning for the foolish, it is also a warning for those who have once been wise, for those who once asked for the right thing, who once began with humility, who once were respected by others, who once saw the hand of God in their lives. Because no one is protected from drifting away merely by having had a beautiful beginning. What protects a human being is not the memory that he once was right. It is humble faithfulness renewed every day. That night at Gibeon, Solomon asked for a listening heart. And perhaps, in his whole story, that remains his most beautiful request. A request rising from a young king in the quiet darkness, before the gold and silver piled high, before his fame spread far, before alliances grew complicated, before the palace held too many voices pulling his heart in different directions. At that time, everything was still soft, like the first light of day. The throne was still new. The heart still knew how to bow. And the warning in the law still lay there, like a small lamp beside the road, waiting to see how long the wisest king of Israel would keep that light. From here, the the story will begin to change color. Not immediately, not with a loud fall, but through layers of power built around a man who had once been deeply humble, through choices that seemed wise, yet would later need to be examined again beneath the light of the ancient warning. Solomon asked for wisdom, and he truly received it. But the question that remains, the question that will follow us into the next chapters, is quieter, deeper, and more frightening. Can a person who has been given wisdom always remain humble enough to live according to that wisdom? After the night at Gibeon, after the prayer for wisdom that pleased God, Solomon stepped into the first years of his reign with a very special light surrounding him. People began to hear of his righteous judgment. They retold the story of the two women and the child as a sign that the wisdom of God truly rested upon the young king. And in those days, Israel seemed to be standing before a new dawn. But the stories of the Bible rarely move in only one shade of light. Almost as soon as the light of wisdom began to shine over Solomon's reign, the biblical story quietly placed, far in the distance, a very old shadow. That shadow did not return through war. It did not march an army to the gates of Jerusalem. It did not bring the sound of swords, shouting, or the smoke and fire of an invasion. It returned much more gently, through diplomatic meetings, through trade, through companies of war horses brought along red, dusty roads, through chariots rolling slowly beneath the sun, and through a name that, for Israel, could never be heard as the name of an ordinary nation. Egypt, to other peoples, Egypt may have been a great kingdom in the south, a wealthy, ancient, powerful land with armies, war horses, chariots, and rivers that nourished an entire civilization. But to Israel, Egypt was also a memory. It was the place where their ancestors had once lived in slavery, the place where hands had been forced to knead mud, gather straw, and make bricks beneath the whip, the place where the sighs of the oppressed had risen through long and weary days, the place where Pharaoh once believed he could hold the people of God forever within his power. And from that very place, God had brought Israel out of darkness. That is why, whenever the Bible mentions Egypt in the story of Israel's kings, the name always carries a special weight. It does not merely evoke a land, it evokes a painful past, a mighty deliverance, and a lesson Israel was never allowed to forget. In the book of Deuteronomy, before Israel truly had a king like the nations around them, the law gave a warning for the future king. That king was not to accumulate too many horses for himself, and especially, he was not to cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire more horses. At first, it sounds like a very short sentence, but when placed inside Israel's memory, that sentence becomes much deeper. For long ago, when God brought Israel out of Egypt, they did not escape by military strength. They did not have more horses than Pharaoh. They did not have more chariots than Egypt. They did not have a stronger army with which to open a path for themselves. They had only God leading them. Before them, the sea opened. Behind them, Pharaoh's chariots came in pursuit. The sound of Egyptian hooves had once been the sound of terror. The wheels of those chariots had once raised dust behind them, like a nightmare drawing near. But then, in the very place where there seemed to be no escape, God did what no human power could do. He opened a way through the sea, and the strength of Egypt was swallowed beneath the waters. From that moment, Israel learned something deeply important. They were not saved because they became like Egypt. They were saved because God was with them. But as time passes, even memory can fade. Those who had once heard the whips in Egypt eventually passed away. Those who had walked through the sea also lay down. One by one, the wilderness became an old story. Manna became a memory retold to children. And the generations that followed grew up in another world. A world where Israel had land, cities, harvests, a capital, and a throne. Then came the days of Solomon. Israel was no longer a wandering people in the wilderness. Israel had Jerusalem. It had a palace. It had a royal court. It had officials. It had trade routes. It had territories under its influence. It had a young king who had once asked God to give him wisdom. And when a kingdom begins to grow strong, it also begins to face very practical questions. How can peace be preserved? How can the borders be protected? How can the surrounding nations be made to respect it? How can Israel not only survive, but become a stable kingdom among people stronger, more experienced, and more ancient than itself? In the ancient world, one very visible answer was horses and chariots. War horses symbolize speed, strength, and power. Chariots symbolize the army, defense, and the ability to make enemies think twice before drawing near. A king with many horses and many chariots was often seen as a strong king. A kingdom with chariot cities, cavalry forces, and trade routes for buying and selling horses was often viewed as a kingdom that had matured, learned to defend itself, and entered the ranks of the great powers of the region. So, if we look only through political eyes, Solomon's building of military strength could appear very reasonable. A king needs to protect his people. A nation needs stability. A new dynasty needs the respect of other nations. But the warning in Scripture does not only ask whether this is reasonable, it asks something deeper. Where is the king's heart placing its trust? In God, the one who once opened the sea for Israel? Or in horses, chariots, trade routes, and symbols of power that the empires around them had always boasted in? That is why the shadow of Egypt in this story matters so much. Because if Israel begins to turn back toward Egypt to find horses, chariots, and a sense of security, then that return is not merely a business transaction. It is like a very slow forgetting. A forgetting that this nation was once delivered not by the strength of chariots, but by the hand of God. And sometimes, human beings do not return to the past in chains. They return through reasons that sound very wise. Through diplomacy, through trade, through the need to protect the nation, through choices that seem necessary. That is why the first sign of Solomon's drifting does not appear as a loud sin. It appears very quietly, in the sound of horse hooves, in the wheels of chariots rolling over dusty roads, in the name Egypt returning to the edge of the story, and in the ancient warning still lying there, like a small lamp reminding us that an Israelite king may use power, but must never let power become the place where he places his trust. A war horse was not only a means of transport, it was a symbol. A kingdom with many horses and chariots was a kingdom capable of moving quickly, striking forcefully, defending itself well, and making its enemies hesitate before coming near. A chariot, with solid wheels, a skilled driver, and a warrior standing on its platform, could become a haunting presence on the battlefield. It did not merely cause casualties, it caused fear. When a line of chariots charged across a plain, the ground seemed to tremble beneath the horses' hooves. Dust rose high. Metal flashed. The sound of wheels grinding over dry earth was like a warning cry of power. For foreign kings, having many horses was natural. A king who wanted to be great needed a strong army. To have a strong army, he needed horses. To have horses, he needed trade, money, alliances, transport routes, and relationships with the regions capable of supplying them. But Israel was not called to become a kingdom exactly like the other kingdoms. This is very important. The Bible does not deny that a king must govern a real country, with real dangers, real borders, and real enemies. But the law places a fence around the heart of the king. The issue is not only whether he has military tools. The issue is whether those tools begin to take the place of trust. A chariot can stand in a storehouse as a means of protection. But when the king looks at it and feels that his peace rests there, the chariot has become more than a machine of war. It has become an object of trust. And the warning in Deuteronomy does not only aim at the number of horses, it touches something deeper. Do not let Israel return to the way of thinking of Egypt. Do not let a people who have been delivered learn to trust in the symbols of the one who once held them captive. Do not let a kingdom founded by covenant become a copy of an empire. In the records concerning Solomon, the Bible shows that he truly accumulated chariots and horses. The numbers mentioned are not small. He had chariot cities, horsemen, and organized military systems serving the reign. And especially, the passages describing Solomon's trade speak of horses and chariots being brought from Egypt, as well as from other regions, into the king's network of exchange. On the surface, this could look like an achievement. A young kingdom under Solomon was becoming more ordered, more capable of defense, and more recognized by other nations. Merchants could travel along long routes. Those responsible for storehouses, stables, chariot cities, and military posts may have worked day and night to keep that entire system moving. Imagine a quiet morning in one of Solomon's chariot cities. Mist still lies thin over the ground. The horse keepers wake before dawn to check the reins, the wheels, the wooden axles, and the leather coverings around the chariots. The horses breathe out white vapor in the early air. Their hooves tap softly against the hard earth, while young soldiers practice keeping their balance on the chariots, preparing for a kingdom that is growing stronger and stronger. Everything looks orderly, necessary, reasonable. A king needs to protect his nation. A kingdom needs secure borders after many years of war and instability. Israel also needs to be regarded with respect by the peoples around it. If viewed only through political eyes, Solomon's accumulation of horses and chariots seems like a sign of wisdom. But it is precisely there that the ancient warning begins to sound. In Deuteronomy, the king of Israel is told not to accumulate too many horses, and not to cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire more horses. That warning is not only about the military, it is about the king's trust. Because for Israel, Egypt is never merely a land in the south. Egypt is the memory of chains, the place where their ancestors were once slaves, the place where Pharaoh's chariots once pursued them to the edge of the sea. And it was there, at that very place, that God opened a path through the waters so that his people would understand that deliverance does not come from war horses or chariots, but from him. Yet now, under Solomon's reign, the roads leading back toward Egypt were being opened through trade. The chariots that had once been symbols of fear were becoming royal possessions. Horses from the south were entering Israel's system of power as part of a new prosperity. Perhaps Solomon did not see this as betrayal. Perhaps he saw only diplomacy, security, and benefit for the kingdom. Perhaps he believed he was wise enough to use the tools of empires without being reshaped by them in his own heart. But that is exactly what makes this sign so frightening. Drifting away does not always begin with a loud sin. Sometimes it begins with things that sound very reasonable, with the need to protect the nation, with the desire to build prestige, with choices called necessary. And then, little by little, the real question appears. Where is Solomon placing his trust? In God, the one who once delivered Israel from Egypt? Or in horses, chariots, trade routes, and symbols of power that the kingdoms around him had always boasted in? This is not yet the storm, not yet the collapse, not yet the moment when the kingdom will be torn in two. But it is a small cloud on the horizon, a very quiet sound within the story, a hoofbeat echoing from the south, reminding the listener that the warning in Scripture has never disappeared. Solomon is still the wise king. His reign is still growing stronger. Israel is still entering a time of stability and glory. But beneath that order, a quiet question begins to follow him. Can an Israelite king use strength without turning strength into his refuge? Can a kingdom delivered by God return to the symbols of Egypt without losing its sacred memory? And can a man who once asked for a listening heart still hear the warning? When the sound of hooves and chariot wheels begins to rise around the throne. In the biblical memory, Solomon was not only the wise king, he was also the builder. And the greatest work attached to his name was the temple in Jerusalem, the place that would become the spiritual center of Israel for generations to come, before Solomon's time. The people of Israel had traveled a very long road. There was a time when they worshipped in the wilderness, with the tabernacle being raised and taken down at each stage of the journey. There was a time when the Ark of the Covenant went with the people across rivers, through battles, and through years of unrest. Their faith was preserved by memory, by instruction passed down, by rituals, and by the presence of God among a people who did not yet have one fixed place where all their hopes could gather. But under Solomon, everything seemed to be drawn toward a single point. Jerusalem became the center of the kingdom. The throne of David was there. And then, the temple was built there as well. Imagine the first mornings of that construction. Great stones prepared with care. Cedar beams from Lebanon brought in, carrying the fragrance of the northern forests. Carvers, carriers, overseers, and scribes all entering into a project meant not only for one lifetime, but for the memory of an entire people. The temple was not built like an ordinary palace. It was not merely a beautiful structure for people to look up at and wonder. It was the place where the Ark of the Covenant would be placed, the place where Israel would remember that God had made a covenant with them, the place where the prayers, sacrifices, repentance, and hope of the nation would gather together. Therefore, when gold was used in the temple, it did not merely carry the meaning of luxury in the holy place. Gold reflected reverence. It made the space different from ordinary life. It declared that this place was set apart, that it did not belong to human ambition, but to the worship of God. The inner walls were overlaid with gold. The vessels of the temple were made with care. The doors, the tables, the lampstands, the most holy place, and every carved detail carried a sense of solemn beauty. When the light from the lamps touched those surfaces, one can imagine a radiance that was soft and deep, unlike the light of the marketplace, the street, or the palace. It was the light of the holy place, a light that made people walk more slowly, speak more quietly, and remember that some things cannot be measured by power or wealth. Then came the day of the temple's dedication. The Ark of the Covenant was brought in. The priests walked with solemn dignity. The people gathered. The sounds of prayer and sacrifice rose through Jerusalem. Solomon stood before the altar, in front of the entire assembly of Israel, and offered a prayer. In that prayer, he understood something profoundly important. God could not be confined inside a house of stone and gold. Heaven, even the heaven of heavens, could not contain him. The temple did not make God smaller. The temple was the place where the people turned their hearts toward him, where they asked for forgiveness, where they remembered that their lives still depended on the mercy of God. It was one of the most beautiful moments in Solomon's reign. A king stood before the greatest work of his life, yet still acknowledged that this work could never contain the fullness of God's greatness. A king who held power, materials, builders, gold, silver, and fame in his hands still bowed in prayer before the one higher than every throne. If we looked only at that moment, we might feel that Solomon's reign was standing at the very center of the light. The prayer for wisdom at Gibeon had led to an ordered kingdom. That wisdom had led to peace. That peace had allowed the temple to be built. And that temple became a sign that Israel was not merely surviving, but entering a time more stable, more glorious, and more sacred. But the biblical story does not stop in the light. Right beside the temple, other buildings were also rising. Solomon did not only build a house for God, he also built a palace for himself. The Bible tells us that the temple was built in 7 years, while Solomon's palace took 13 years to complete. That detail should not be used to draw a hasty conclusion, but it does make the listener pause. For after the holy place, the story begins to move toward the palace. After the altar, the story moves toward the throne. After gold used for worship, the story begins to speak of gold surrounding royal power. A kingdom needs an administrative center. A king needs a place to receive envoys, to judge cases, to govern the nation, and to organize the royal court. A real country needs a real system. None of these things are wrong in themselves, but as that system grows larger, it also begins to demand more. more materials, more labor, more taxes, more servants, more resources to keep the light of the court from going out. And it is here that this chapter begins to change color, not from light into darkness all at once, but like evening light beginning to cast shadows over golden walls. The temple shone brightly, but the kingdom also began to grow heavier. Roads had to carry materials. Laborers had to serve the great construction projects. Officials had to collect provisions, manage resources, coordinate territories, care for the palace, the army, the court, and one building project after another. Everything functioned like a vast machine, seen from far away. People saw glory, but seen more closely. They also saw weight. This is the difficult and profound point in Solomon's story. The Bible does not deny the splendor of his reign. On the contrary, the biblical pages describe Solomon's wealth, wisdom, fame, and order with very powerful images. Silver became as common as stones. Gold was brought in. Tribute and trade made Jerusalem even more radiant. Kings and distant peoples heard of his name. But within that light, the ancient warning began to sound again. The king must not accumulate too much silver and gold for himself. That warning does not say that gold itself is evil. The temple itself used gold. The issue lies in purpose and in the heart. When gold is used to honor God, it belongs to worship. But when gold begins to glorify the king, to weigh down the king's treasury, to make the court the center of admiration, then gold is no longer merely a precious metal. It becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, human beings can very easily begin to see their own greatness. Imagine Jerusalem in those years. In the morning, sunlight falls upon the temple. The walls begin to shine. Pilgrims go up with reverence in their hearts. The scent of sacrifice, the sound of prayer, and the footsteps on stone all blend together like the sacred breath of a people. But in another part of the city, the palace also awakens. Officials come and go. Envoys from distant lands arrive. Goods are recorded. Gifts are counted. The throne is set in majesty. Golden shields, precious objects, and symbols of power make the royal court splendid. That city had two kinds of light. One light turned the hearts of the people toward God, and another light began to revolve around the throne of man. The danger was not that these two lights immediately opposed one another. The danger was that they could be confused. A people might look at the king's wealth and assume it was surely a sign of blessing. A court might look at the streams of tribute and believe that its fame was proof that every decision was right. A king could build the temple for God, while at the same time allowing his palace to become a place where human power was admired too deeply. Gold has a very gentle voice. It does not shout. It does not command. It only whispers quietly to the heart. You have succeeded. You are respected. You are safe. You are great. The nations come to you. Kings hear your name. Your treasury is full. Your city shines. Your throne is secure. Those words sound very sweet, but for a king of Israel, they are also dangerous words, because that king had been instructed to read the law all the days of his life, so that his heart would not lift itself above his brothers. He had been told to live under the word of God, not to stand over the people like a small god. He had been told to remember that the throne was not a place for accumulating private glory. but a place for serving in reverence. Therefore, the question of this chapter is not only how wealthy Solomon became. The deeper question is this: what is that wealth doing to the soul of the kingdom? Is it making the people more grateful to God? Or making them more fascinated by the glory of the court? Is it making the king more humble before the one who gave him wisdom? Or is it beginning to make him accustomed to the feeling that every road leads back to his own palace? In ancient stories, gold often possesses an enchanting beauty. Gold does not rot like wood, rust like iron, or fade like cloth. It holds light for so long that human beings easily believe that whatever is covered in gold will be just as enduring. But the Bible often reminds us that what makes a kingdom stand is not gold on the walls, but faithfulness in the heart. Solomon was at the summit, and it is precisely at the summit that human beings often find it hardest to hear a warning. When we are weak, we know we need help. When we lack, we know we need to rely on another. When Solomon first came to the throne, he said he was still young and did not know how to go out or come in. That was a beautiful confession, because it was the voice of a man who understood his own limits. But when everything has been built, when the temple has been completed, when the palace has risen high, when gold and silver have flowed in, when distant nations have come, when the king's name is spoken with admiration, the sense of limitation can begin to fade. Not because a person deliberately chooses to forget, but because success has its own lullaby. It whispers that everything is still all right. It whispers that our decisions have been correct. It whispers that the splendor around us is proof that heaven is smiling, and sometimes, within that lullaby, the ancient warning becomes very small. The king must not accumulate too much silver and gold for himself. That line still remains, but amid praise, palace lights, gifts, trade, ceremony, and fame, who still pauses long enough to hear? What makes Solomon's story so moving is that the Bible does not tell of the fracture by destroying his light immediately. Instead, the Bible allows us to look at that light for a long time. The temple truly was beautiful. The prayer of dedication truly was deep. Solomon's wisdom truly was known among the nations. That age truly was radiant in Israel's memory. But precisely because the light was real, the darkness behind it becomes even more frightening. Something can be both a blessing and a test. Wealth can help build, but it can also teach people to accumulate. Fame can open doors to peace, but it can also feed the ego. The temple can turn the people toward God, but if the king's heart is not guarded, even a sacred age can exist beside dangerous seeds. So, in this chapter, we do not need to rush to conclude that Solomon has fallen. That moment has not yet come. We only need to feel the weight increasing. In the previous chapter, the first sign was the sound of horse hooves from Egypt. In this chapter, the next sign is the gleam of gold. Not the gold of worship, but the gold that begins to spread too far, covering the palace, the treasury, the throne, the fame, and the machinery of power. The more radiant a nation becomes, the more it needs in order to keep that radiance alive. The larger a royal court becomes, the more resources it needs to sustain it. The more admired a king becomes, the easier it is for him to become bound to the very image others praise in him. And the heavier a kingdom becomes, the more the people begin to feel that weight in their daily lives, even if the crack has not yet appeared in public. Imagine one night in Jerusalem after those years of building. The wind moves softly over the rooftops. The temple stands still on the heights, like a sacred lamp in the darkness. The palace lies nearby, vast, majestic, silent after a day filled with voices. In the storehouses, gold still glitters though no one is looking. On the roads, laborers return home, tired, but perhaps also proud that they have contributed to the great works of their age. The city sleeps beneath a beauty that cannot be denied. Yet beneath that beauty, the warning remains awake. That warning does not stand against the temple. It does not deny the wisdom. It does not erase the blessings that have been given. It only asks a question every age must hear when silver and gold increase. Does the human heart remain light enough to bow before God? And that is where this chapter allows us to pause. Not before a heap of ashes, not before a fallen throne, but before a city shining brightly, a temple that has moved Israel to awe, a palace that has astonished the nations, a reign that has entered its golden age, and an ancient warning walking quietly beside every gleam of gold. The danger of glory does not lie in the fact that it is evil from the beginning. It lies in the fact that it is too beautiful. Beautiful enough that human beings may forget to ask, is this light leading me back to God? Or is it making me fall in love with my own throne? Solomon built the temple. Jerusalem shone. The nations began to look toward Israel with wonder, but the kingdom also began to grow heavier, heavy with great works, heavy with the machinery of power, heavy with gold, silver, and fame, heavy with a splendor that always demanded to be fed. And when a kingdom begins to grow heavy, the heart of the king must be humble enough not to be pulled down by that weight. That was Solomon's test in the golden light. Not the test of poverty, not the test of failure, but the test of success, and perhaps in human life. That is one of the hardest tests to recognize. After the golden light of the temple, after the radiant walls of Jerusalem, after the palace, the treasuries, the throne, and the fame that spread far among the surrounding nations, Solomon's story comes to one of the most famous details of his entire life, and also one of the easiest to misunderstand. 1,000 wives. That number alone is enough to make the listener pause. It is too large, too distant from ordinary life, too easy to become a story of curiosity. But if we look at that number only as something strange in the private life of an ancient king, we will miss what the Bible truly wants to place before our eyes. In Solomon's story, 1,000 wives are not mentioned as a palace rumor meant to astonish people. They are presented as a sign that the heart of the king, who once asked for wisdom, was no longer whole as it had been in the beginning. The Bible says Solomon had 700 wives of royal rank and 300 concubines. Those numbers do not only suggest the luxury of a royal court, they suggest a vast political world being brought inside the palace of Jerusalem. For in the age of ancient kings, royal marriage was often not merely a matter of affection. A marriage could be a treaty, A princess entering the palace could carry an entire kingdom behind her. An alliance could be sealed not only by documents or oaths, but by the presence of a woman inside the royal household. Therefore, when Solomon married many foreign women, the story was not simply a story of personal desire, it was also a story of power, diplomacy, security, and ambition. Each marriage of that kind could open a road to Moab, a road to Ammon, a road to Edom, a road to Sidon, a road to the Hittite peoples, and from farther away still, the road that had once opened toward Egypt. Seen from the outside, all of this could appear very reasonable. A wise king wanted to preserve peace. A prosperous kingdom needed relationships with the surrounding nations. A rising dynasty needed to reduce the risk of war through royal connections. If a foreign princess was inside Solomon's palace, then behind her there might be a court less willing to confront him, a quieter border, a safer trade route, a relationship tied together by the bond of family. But the warning in Deuteronomy had already gone ahead of all those reasons. The king of Israel was not to have many wives, so that his heart would not be turned aside. That sentence is very short, but when placed beside Solomon's life, it becomes almost painful. For the Bible does not merely say that Solomon had many wives. The Bible says clearly that those wives turned his heart toward other gods. Here, the focus of the story is not to place blame on the women. The focus is the responsibility of the king. Solomon was the one who held power. He was the one who had been given wisdom. He was the one who had heard the law. He was the one who had built the temple. He was the one who knew that Israel was called to live differently from the surrounding nations that worshipped foreign gods. Therefore, when his palace became a place where too many influences entered, the danger did not lie in the presence of each individual person, but in the fact that the king had allowed his heart to open itself to too many different centers. Imagine Solomon's palace during those years of glory. It was no longer only the residence of an Israelite king. It became a miniature world. In the inner courts, one could hear many different languages among the retinues. One could see clothing from many lands, gifts, spices, rituals, memories of homelands, stories of the gods worshipped by each people. All quietly entered the royal space. Each foreign wife did not come alone. She might bring habits, servants, music, forms of worship, homesickness, and pressures that a diplomatic king would have to consider. At first, those things may have seemed small in Solomon's eyes, a concession to preserve harmony, a private ritual for someone who had come from far away, a small place of worship to satisfy an alliance, a gesture considered politically wise, a way to keep the palace peaceful, the borders calm, and foreign relationships unharmed. But it is often precisely such small things that turn the human heart most slowly and most deeply. A fall does not always begin with one great decision. Sometimes it begins with closing one's eyes once, then once again, with a reason that sounds sympathetic, then with another reason that sounds even more reasonable, with telling oneself that this is only diplomacy, that is only custom, this matter is only temporary, and the heart is still in the right place. Solomon may have thought he was wise enough to control it all. He had once judged a case no one else could untangle. He had once asked for a listening heart. He had once built a kingdom of order and prestige. He had once brought Israel into an age that made distant nations look on in wonder. Perhaps precisely because of this, the danger became even harder to recognize. A person who has succeeded in many things can easily believe that he will also be able to control the next one. But the human heart is not like a political map. A map can be divided into regions, marked with borders, controlled by roads, and named place by place. The heart is not like that. The heart can be drawn away by small things, by affection, by habit, by closeness, by whispers repeated over many years. A king may rule over many peoples and still fail to rule the silent directions within his own heart. The Bible uses a very clear image. Solomon's heart was no longer wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. That is a heavy sentence. It does not say that Solomon immediately forgot God. It does not say the temple disappeared. It does not say every light within him went out at once. What is more frightening is that his heart was no longer whole, no longer fixed in one direction, no longer centered on one thing. There could still be memory of God. The temple could still stand in Jerusalem. The fame of the wise king could still remain. But inside, the heart had been divided into many paths. And when the heart of the king was divided, the kingdom also began to carry signs of division within its own soul. Jerusalem had the temple, but around the city, high places for foreign gods began to appear. The city that had been built as the center of worship to the Lord now had to witness other smoke rising. The sacred air was mingled with concession. Faithfulness began to stand beside compromise. The light of the holy place was still there, but strange shadows had appeared on the hills. Here, the story becomes more painful because Solomon was not someone who did not know. He was not a foreign king who had never heard the law of Israel. He was not a stranger to the covenant. He was the man who had prayed on the day the temple was dedicated. He had said that God hears the prayers of his people. He had stood in the midst of the assembly of Israel, before the holy place, and acknowledged that no building on earth could contain the fullness of God's greatness. And that very man, later on, allowed other centers of worship to rise within his own kingdom. Perhaps there is no sorrow more silent than the sorrow of someone who once knew the light, but gradually became accustomed to the darkness. Solomon did not lose everything in a single night. He did not wake up one morning and become a completely different man. His drifting was like a gently sloping road downward. The first step did not frighten anyone. The second could still be explained. The third became a habit, and by the time a person looks back, he realizes he has gone much farther than he once thought he would ever go. Therefore, Solomon's 1,000 wives are not only a number that provokes astonishment. In the flow of the biblical story, they become the image of a heart with too many voices pulling it in different directions. They may be the voices of affection, of diplomacy, of peace, of power, of the surrounding nations, of unfamiliar rituals, of the desire to please alliances, and of a palace too wide, with too many doors, too many corridors, and too many whispers. In the midst of all those voices, the voice of the ancient warning slowly grew smaller. The king must not have many wives, so that his heart would not be turned aside. That line was still there, like a lamp placed beside the road, but in Solomon's palace, too many other lamps were burning, the lights of festivals, of diplomacy, of royal banquets, of admiration, of alliances that seemed able to guarantee peace for the kingdom. And sometimes, human beings do not lose the light because darkness is too strong. They lose the light because too many other things are also glittering. Until their eyes can no longer tell what the true light is. What makes this story so moving is that it does not speak only about Solomon. It touches a truth very close to human beings in every age. Not everyone has a throne, a palace, gold and silver, or 1,000 wives. But everyone can have a heart pulled in too many directions. Everyone can begin with a sincere prayer and then slowly live by compromises they call necessary. Everyone can think they are still in control, while in truth, the very things they keep close beside them have already begun quietly shaping them. For Solomon, those marriage alliances may once have been seen as tools to preserve peace. But when that tool crossed the boundary Scripture had set, it was no longer only politics, it became a road into the soul. A kingdom may use marriage to connect borders, but the king cannot turn his heart into a treaty without limits. There are things which, if offered too long as a price of exchange, will eventually no longer remain whole, and the heart is one of them. Imagine Solomon in the later years of that splendor. He had passed through his humble youth, had seen the temple completed, had sat upon the throne as distant envoys came to him, had heard his name praised across many lands. He had seen gold and silver, war horses, the palace, great works, and royal marriages make his kingdom more radiant than ever before. But at the same time, there were also more voices around him, more requests, more rituals that had to be tolerated. And those first concessions had perhaps become a familiar part of palace life. One afternoon, as sunlight fell across the walls of Jerusalem, the temple still stood there, quiet and solemn, but farther away, on the high places. Other smoke may also have risen. That city no longer had only one direction of vision, and in that image, Solomon's tragedy appears very clearly. He had built a place for God, yet he had allowed his heart to open itself to too many other things. This was not yet the moment when judgment was announced. Nor was it yet the moment when the kingdom was torn in two before everyone's eyes. But this was where the crack became deeper. In the previous chapter, the kingdom had begun to grow heavy with gold and silver, with great works, and with the machinery of power. In this chapter, the king's heart began to grow heavy with the bonds he himself had brought into his life. A person can carry too much gold. A kingdom can carry too much power. And a heart can carry too many compromises. When that heart is no longer light, it no longer easily bows before God as it did in the beginning. When it is pulled by too many cords, it no longer clearly hears the one voice that once gave it life. And when the king who once asked for a listening heart no longer listens as he once did, the wisdom he received cannot replace the faithfulness he was meant to keep. Therefore, Solomon's 1,000 wives are not only a large number in biblical history, they are the symbol of a heart that has lost its focus, a heart that was once bright, but was gradually surrounded by relationships, pressures, compromises, and different voices. A heart that did not collapse because it lacked knowledge, but because it lacked wholeness. And perhaps that is the most frightening thing in this story. Solomon was still Solomon. The wise king still had a radiant past behind him. The temple still stood in Jerusalem. His fame still echoed far away. But within him, the most important thing had begun to turn. The ancient warning did not say that the king must not have many wives, merely because it would make the court complicated. It said something deeper and more painful, so that the heart would not be turned aside. Here, we begin to understand why the Bible places the number 1,000 inside Solomon's story. Not to make the listener curious about the palace, but to make the listener see what can happen when a king has too many things to love, too many things to keep, too many alliances to please, until the heart that once turned toward God is no longer whole as it was before. Night falls over Jerusalem. The temple remains silent in the darkness. The palace remains vast. The corridors are still full of shadows. The lamps still burn in the inner rooms. But somewhere beneath that appearance of peace, the warning of Scripture is no longer only an ancient line of text. It has become truth in the life of a king, not through thunder, not through a loud fall, but through the very slow division of a heart. After the golden years, after the temple shone over Jerusalem, after the vast palace, after the companies of horses and chariots, the treasures, and the royal marriages that connected Israel with the surrounding nations, Solomon's story entered a very different kind of silence. No longer was there the sound of hammers shaping stone in the days of construction. No longer was there the rejoicing of the people on the day the temple was dedicated. No longer was there the sound of envoys entering the royal court with gifts and words of praise. In this chapter, the sound begins to fall lower. It is the sound of judgment drawing near. What is frightening in Solomon's story is not that the light went out immediately. The temple still stood. Jerusalem still remained majestic. Solomon's name still echoed far and wide. But beneath that appearance of stability, the Bible reveals that something deeper had changed. The king's heart was no longer whole as it had once been. High places for foreign gods had appeared. The compromises inside the palace were no longer merely private matters of the royal household. They had begun to touch the soul of the entire kingdom. And when the heart of the one sitting on the throne was divided, the throne itself could not go on forever as if nothing had happened. Before the judgment in Solomon's life was announced, the Bible had already recorded another warning. After the temple and the palace had been completed, God appeared to Solomon once more, not in the young beginning at Gibeon, when Solomon asked for wisdom, but after he already held so much in his hands. The first time, Solomon stood before God as a young king who knew his own lack. The next time, he stood among the achievements that had been built, in the midst of a kingdom growing strong, and it was precisely then that the warning became more serious. God said that if Solomon walked before him with an upright heart, as David had done, keeping his commandments and statutes, then his throne would be established. But if Solomon or his descendants turned away from God and worshipped other gods, then even that radiant temple could not become a protective charm for them. The temple might be a holy place, but it could not replace faithfulness. Walls of stone and gold could not protect a people if their hearts had already departed from the covenant. This is a very deep idea in the story. Human beings often find it easy to believe that great works can preserve blessing. They look at a temple, a palace, a tradition, a reputation, and think that such things are enough to guarantee the future. But in the Bible, what preserves a kingdom is not the outer beauty of a place of worship, but the inner faithfulness of the worshiper. The temple may shine beneath the sun of Jerusalem, but if the king and the people turn away from God, that light cannot hide the darkness within the heart. And then what had once been warned began to become reality. The Bible says that God became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from him, though he had appeared to him twice. That sentence is heavy. It does not speak of a man who had never known the way. It speaks of a man who had been met, had been given, had been warned, had been lifted up, and had been entrusted with so much. Solomon did not fall in ignorance. He fell after knowing the light, and for that reason, the judgment pronounced upon him makes the listener grow quiet. God declared that because Solomon had done this, because he had not kept the covenant and the statutes that had been commanded, the kingdom would be torn away from him and given to one of his servants. But that judgment would not fall in its fullness during Solomon's own lifetime. Because of David, his father, and because of Jerusalem, the city God had chosen. That tearing would not happen completely while Solomon was still alive. It would happen in the days of his son. And even then, the entire kingdom would not be taken away from the house of David. A portion would still be preserved, like a trace of promise and mercy. Here, the story carries a very solemn beauty. God judges, yet even within judgment, he remembers David. There is severity, but there are also limits. There is consequence, but not complete erasure. This means the story is not simply about a sudden outburst of anger. It is the result of a covenant treated lightly, a warning ignored, and a heart that had slowly moved away from its center. From that moment, the atmosphere of Solomon's reign began to change. The splendor remained, but the peace was no longer whole. The cracks that had once lain deep beneath the stone now began to show themselves through outward disturbances. The Bible says that God raised up adversaries against Solomon. This matters deeply because the fracture in the king's heart did not remain only in the king's heart. It began to touch borders, politics, security, and the future of the entire nation. One of those who opposed Solomon was Hadad the Edomite. Hadad's story carries the listener away from Jerusalem and back into territories that had once fallen under the influence of David. While David was still alive, Edom had been defeated in that assault. Hadad, while still a child, had fled to Egypt. He grew up in a foreign land, was received by Pharaoh, and later, when he heard that David and Joab had died, he returned. Hadad's return was like an old memory that had never been fully buried. A wound from the wars of David's time now awakened in the later years of Solomon. From another direction, Rezin also rose up. He had once fled from his master, then gathered men around him and became a force that opposed Israel. Rezin ruled in Damascus and became an enemy of Israel throughout the days of Solomon. If Hadad was the shadow of Edom, then Rezin was a shadow from the north, from the region of Syria. another thorn piercing the peace Solomon had once built. These names may not be as famous as Solomon, but in the flow of the biblical story, they appear as signs. When a kingdom remains within blessing and wholeness, dangers may be held at a distance. But when the king departs from the warning, the things once pressed down begin to rise. Old enemies return. Border unrest awakens. Political cracks widen. A reign may still be wealthy, still beautiful, still remembered with fame. Yet, its inner peace is no longer what it was. And yet, the most important figure in this chapter is not Hadad, nor is it Rezon. It is Jeroboam, a servant of Solomon. The Bible says Jeroboam was a capable man. Solomon saw that this young man worked well, so he placed him over part of the forced labor of the house of Joseph. That detail is very striking. Jeroboam did not appear from the outside as an invader. He appeared from within Solomon's own system. He was someone who had seen that system operate, had understood the weight of its projects, had known how the kingdom was organized, and perhaps had also seen the burdens that the people had to carry. Then one day, Jeroboam went out from Jerusalem, and on the road, he met the prophet Ahijah of Shiloh. This scene is cinematic, but also very quiet. It was not in the palace, not before the throne, not in the middle of a festival. It was only a meeting on the road, outside the city, where a prophetic word could rise in open space. Ahijah was wearing a new cloak, and then he did something strange. He took hold of that cloak and tore it into 12 pieces. Imagine that moment slowly, a new garment being torn in the hands of the prophet, the sound of fabric ripping through the silence, 12 pieces falling apart, as if the 12 tribes of Israel were being placed before the eyes. Then Ahijah told Jeroboam to take 10 pieces, because God would tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and give 10 tribes to him. But because of David and because of Jerusalem, one tribe would remain for the house of David. This is the central image of the chapter. Before this, we heard the warning in the law. Then we saw Solomon touch each boundary: horses, Egypt, silver and gold, many wives. A heart turned aside. Now the warning was no longer only writing on a scroll. It became a torn cloak. It had shape. It had sound. It had pieces of cloth lying in the hand of the man who would become a major figure in the events to come. That torn cloak did not merely foretell a political change. It revealed what had already happened in the deeper layer of the story. Solomon's heart had been divided, and therefore the kingdom would also be divided. The fracture within the king would finally appear outside in history. What began as compromise inside the palace would end as a tear within the nation. What had seemed private would become national. What had seemed small would become impossible to hide. However, the prophecy given to Jeroboam also carried a condition. Ahijah said that if Jeroboam listened to all that God commanded, walked in his ways, did what was right, and kept his statutes, then God would be with him and build him an enduring house. This shows that the heart of the story is not simply replacing Solomon with another man. The issue is not the name of the person sitting on the throne, but the heart of that person before God. The same warning given to Israel's king still stood there, enduring and unchanged. Whoever rises to power must face it. When Solomon learned about Jeroboam, he sought to kill him. Jeroboam had to flee to Egypt and remained there until Solomon died. This detail brings the shadow of Egypt back once again. From the beginning of the story, Egypt has appeared as a complex place of memory, the former land of slavery, the source of horses, the place of diplomatic alliance, and now the refuge of the man who would be involved in the division of the kingdom. Egypt is like a shadow walking beside Solomon's story, not always at the center, but each time it appears. It reminds the listener that the history of Israel can never be separated from the memory of being delivered from that land. From here, Solomon's reign entered its final years with a deeply sorrowful beauty. Outwardly, many things still remained intact. The temple still stood. The palace was still broad. The king's fame was still remembered. But within the story, the future had already been declared. A kingdom may remain whole on the map for a time, but in the Word of God, it had already been torn. Sometimes history needs a few more years to catch up with what has already happened in the spiritual realm. This is what gives the chapter such a quiet feeling. There is no scene of the kingdom collapsing immediately. There is no public day of division here. The people have not yet turned their backs on the house of David. Rehoboam has not yet given his harsh answer. Those things belong to the next chapter. In this chapter, we stand only in the moment before the breaking, when the judgment has been announced. But the final consequence is still waiting for its appointed time. Perhaps that is also one of the most frightening things in human life. Not every consequence comes the moment we take a wrong step. Sometimes, after a compromise, everything remains quiet. After a warning is ignored, the city still shines. After a choice turns away, the palace is still filled with voices. The table is still prepared, and the world still praises. But the delay of consequence does not mean the warning has lost its force. It only means that the crack is moving beneath the surface, waiting for the day it will be revealed. Solomon once asked for a listening heart, but now, the story reveals what he could no longer hear clearly. He could hear the voice of diplomacy. He could hear the voice of power. He could hear the voice of alliances. He could hear the voice of his vast palace. But the voice of the ancient warning, the voice that had said the king must not accumulate many horses, must not accumulate too much silver and gold, must not take many wives so that his heart would be turned aside. That voice had been pushed far down, and when a king no longer hears the warning, judgment will speak, not because God was in haste to destroy what Solomon had built, not because the temple no longer mattered, not because every good thing in his life was erased, but because covenant cannot be replaced by gold. Faithfulness cannot be replaced by buildings. The fear of God cannot be replaced by fame. And wisdom given to a person cannot save that person if he no longer walks in obedience. Picture Solomon in his later years. As night falls over Jerusalem, perhaps he could still see the temple from a high place in the palace. That work was still beautiful, still solemn, still reminding people of the days of glory. But if his heart was quiet enough to remember, perhaps he could also hear again his own voice from the prayer of dedication long ago, when he said that heaven, even the heaven of heavens, could not contain God, and asked him to hear the prayers of his people when they turned toward this place. But the most beautiful prayer of the past cannot replace faithfulness in the present. That is Solomon's deepest sorrow. He had once known. He had once asked. He had once received. He had once built. He had once stood in a light very near to the sacred. And still, he allowed his heart to be drawn away. Therefore, the judgment upon Solomon was not only a political sentence. It was a bell sounding from the center of the biblical story. What happens in the heart of a leader will not remain in that heart forever. It can enter the law, the court, the streets, the children, the nation, and the future. A divided heart can leave behind a divided kingdom. Ahijah's cloak had been torn. 10 pieces were given to Jeroboam. One portion was preserved for the house of David because of the promise and because of Jerusalem. That image is both severe and painful. It shows that God does not forget sin, yet he also does not forget promise. He judges unfaithfulness, yet he still preserves a thread of mercy running through history. Even as the kingdom was preparing to be torn apart, the story had not lost all light. But that light does not make the warning lighter. On the contrary, it makes the warning deeper. For if God still remembered David, still preserved a portion for his house, and yet Solomon still had to face such heavy consequences, then the listener understands that wisdom, fame, and legacy cannot cancel out human responsibility before God. By the end of this chapter, we are not standing before a battlefield. We are standing before a word that has already been spoken. The kingdom has not yet broken apart in the eyes of everyone, but its destiny has changed color. Enemies have risen. Jeroboam has received the prophecy. Solomon has tried to stop it by his own power. But there are things a king cannot hold back simply by command. Night still covers Jerusalem. The temple is still silent. The palace is still there. But in the darkness of the story, it is as though we can hear the sound of fabric tearing in the hands of the prophet. Not loud like thunder, not violent like the sound of an army, only a thin, dry, very brief sound. Yet that sound foretells what an entire kingdom will soon feel. A cloak torn apart, a judgment spoken, a throne still standing, but the future already cracked. And in that silence, the ancient warning finally stepped out from the pages of the scroll, entered history, and stood before Solomon as a truth that could no longer be turned back. After the judgment spoken against Solomon, the story enters a long and deeply sorrowful silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of something already spoken, yet not fully come to pass. The kingdom is still there. Jerusalem is still there. The temple still stands on the heights, silent in the light and darkness of each passing day. The palace remains vast. The throne still belongs to the house of David. But after that judgment, Israel's future is no longer as whole as it once was. Like a piece of cloth already torn in the hands of the prophet Ahijah. The united kingdom under David and Solomon is now only waiting for the moment when that tear will appear before everyone's eyes. Solomon died after 40 years of reign. To many, his death may have seemed like the end of a golden age. A wise king had departed. The builder of the temple had lain down. The man who had made Jerusalem shine with gold and silver, with great works, with fame, and with stories that traveled beyond the borders of Israel. had now become part of memory. But the death of a great king is never only the story of one man. When a king like Solomon dies, he leaves behind more than a tomb. He leaves behind a legacy. And that legacy carries both light and weight. Solomon left behind the temple, the place toward which the people of Israel would turn in prayer. He left behind the memory of wisdom, of righteous judgments, of a reign that caused distant nations to marvel. But he also left behind treasuries that had to be protected, great works that had to be maintained, a large machinery of power, burdens of forced labor, political cracks, and a judgment hanging over the future of his house. A kingdom can look magnificent when people look back at it from far away. But those living inside it may feel something else, the weariness of shoulders that have carried too much. After Solomon died, Rehoboam, his son, came to the throne. And the first moment of the new reign did not unfold in an atmosphere of complete peace. The people gathered at Shechem, a place of great meaning in Israel's history. They did not come there only to bless a new king. They came with a request, and that request revealed what had quietly grown beneath the surface of Solomon's golden age. They told Rehoboam that his father had placed a heavy yoke upon them. They asked him to lighten that harsh service, and if he did, they would serve him. This is one of the most striking moments in the entire story. The people did not begin with rebellion. They did not immediately declare that they were leaving the house of David. They did not take up swords and march into the palace. They simply spoke what they had been carrying in their hearts. The burden is too heavy. Please make it lighter. That request makes us look back at Solomon's reign in a different light. Great works do not rise from the earth by themselves. Palaces do not complete themselves. Treasuries do not fill themselves. Military, administrative, commercial, and royal systems do not operate on their own. Behind the splendor of a reign lies the labor of many people. Behind the golden light of the palace are calloused hands. Behind the admiration of distant nations is the daily life of the people of Israel, those who had to carry the heavy cost of that splendor. Rehoboam stood before a choice, and if we look deeply, that choice was not only political, it was the first test of a new king. Would he rule as one who served the people under the authority of God, or as a king who only wanted to prove his power? Would he hear the warning beneath this entire story, that the king of Israel must not lift himself above his brothers? Or would he walk the path of foreign kings, where the throne is held by hardness and fear? Rehoboam first sought the counsel of the elders, those who had served Solomon while he was still alive. These men understood the palace. They understood the people. They had seen Solomon's glory, but perhaps they also knew its cost. They advised Rehoboam to speak gently to the people. If he served them that day, if he answered them with kindness, they would become his servants forever. That counsel was wise, because it understood a deep principle of kingship in Israel. A truly strong king is not the one who makes the people afraid, but the one who knows how to carry the people's burden before God. But Rehoboam did not stop with that counsel. He went to ask the young men who had grown up with him, those who were close to him in age, in mindset, and in the confidence of a generation that had not yet carried the full weight of history. These young men advised him to answer more harshly. They told him to say to the people that his little finger was thicker than his father's waist, that his father had placed a heavy yoke upon them, but he would make that yoke even heavier. They advised him not to lessen the burden, but to increase it, not to comfort, but to threaten, not to humble himself, but to display power. In that moment, the kingdom seemed to hold its breath. On one side was the council of those who had lived long enough to understand that power needs humility. On the other was the council of those who saw gentleness as weakness. One side was the path of service, the other was the path of pride. And Rehoboam chose the second counsel. When the people returned to hear the answer, the new king spoke to them with hardness. He did not lighten the yoke. He declared that he would make it heavier. He did not heal the crack. He struck it, and at that very moment, what had been foretold began to appear in history. The people of Israel answered with a painful and decisive voice. What portion do we have in David? What inheritance do we have in the son of Jesse? To your tents, O Israel. That was the sound of a kingdom being torn in two, not by an earthquake, not by a foreign army storming in to break the city, not by a night of fire burning over Jerusalem, but by an arrogant answer falling upon the very place where the crack already existed. Rehoboam did not create every cause in a single day. He inherited a system that had become heavy, a people who had grown tired, a judgment that had already been spoken, and a tear already foretold through Ahijah's cloak. But his answer was the final pull that made the tear open before everyone's eyes. The 10 northern tribes left the house of David and followed Jeroboam. The house of David retained only the southern portion, with Judah at its center, and Jerusalem still belonging to the Davidic line from this point on. The kingdom once united under David and Solomon was no longer one whole body. The north would be called Israel, the south would be Judah. Two paths began to separate, carrying their own stories, their own kings, their own failures, their own warnings, and their own tragedies. This is the moment when the ancient warning is fulfilled most clearly. In the first chapter, we saw the law given to the king of Israel. Do not accumulate many horses. Do not cause the people to return to Egypt for more horses. Do not accumulate too much silver and gold. Do not take many wives so that the heart is turned aside. And read the law all the days of life so that the heart will not lift itself above its brothers. Through Solomon's life, each of those warnings seemed to light up one by one. Horses and chariots appeared. The shadow of Egypt returned. Silver and gold were piled high. Royal marriages expanded until the king's heart was drawn away from wholeness. And finally, in the days of his son, the people spoke of the heavy yoke Solomon's reign had placed upon them. What matters is that we should not tell the division of Israel as an event with only one simple cause. It was not only because Solomon had many wives. It was not only because Rehoboam answered wrongly. It was not only because Jeroboam rose up. The biblical story is deeper than that. It shows a chain of driftings. The king's heart moved away from wholehearted faithfulness. Power grew heavy. The machinery of the kingdom became difficult to bear. The people became weary, and the next generation did not have enough humility to mend what had cracked. Therefore, when Israel was divided, it was not only a political event, It was the outward image of an inward truth. Solomon's heart had once been divided by too many voices, and after him, the kingdom also became divided in two directions. What had happened inside the king's heart finally appeared on the map of the nation. A heart no longer whole left behind a land no longer whole. After Rehoboam heard that the northern people had turned away, he still tried to hold on to power. He sent Adoram, the man in charge of forced labor, to the people of Israel, but they stoned him to death. That detail shows how deep the anger of the people had become. The man who represented the system of forced labor became an image of the burden they no longer wanted to carry. Rehoboam had to hurry into his chariot and flee back to Jerusalem. That image stands in complete contrast to the majesty people might have imagined for a new king. He began his reign not with unity, but with flight. Then Rehoboam gathered the house of Judah and Benjamin, intending to fight against Israel and restore the kingdom. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying that they must not go up and fight against their brothers. This matter had come from God. And the people listened to that word and returned, not going forward with the war at that time. This moment is very important, because it shows that the division was not only the result of human temperament. In the flow of the biblical story, it was also the fulfillment of the judgment that had already been declared. Yet that division did not bring true peace. It opened a new chapter of unrest in the history of Israel. Jeroboam became king in the north, but he too had to face the same test every king of Israel must face. Would he trust God, or would he use power to protect his own throne? Because he feared that the people of the north would continue going up to Jerusalem to worship and then return to the house of David. Jeroboam established other centers of worship at Bethel and Dan. But that story belongs to another journey, another crack, another tragedy that would continue long after Solomon. Here, we only need to stand before the moment when Israel was no longer one. Imagine the roads after the day of division. Families that had once shared the same memory now belonged to two kingdoms. Those who had once made pilgrimage toward one center now began to live under two systems of power. The hills, the fields, the small towns, the village gates, all gradually learned to call one another by different political names: North, South, Israel, Judah. A people once drawn out of Egypt as one nation now began to enter history with a deep cut running through the middle. Jerusalem still had the temple, but the presence of the temple could not erase the pain of division. The throne of David still remained in Judah, but the continuation of the dynasty did not return the kingdom to what it had been. The promises of God had not disappeared, but the road of history from this point onward became narrower, more painful, and filled with more warnings. The cost of a heart turned aside did not stop with Solomon's own life. It flowed into the life of the next generation. This is what makes Solomon's story so serious. A king may think that his choices belong only to his own age, but what he accumulates, what he tolerates, what he overlooks, what he no longer hears, all of it can become a burden for those who come after him. Children may inherit a palace, but they also inherit the cracks in its foundation. A generation may inherit the temple, but it also inherits the compromises surrounding the temple. A people may inherit the fame of a golden age, but they also inherit the price of that golden age. And when we look back over the whole journey, we see that the ancient warning never lost its weight. It was not a dry line of law lying in the past. It was a lamp placed before the throne, asking every king, will you rule under the authority of God, or will you make yourself the center? Will you use power to serve, or to make the shoulders of the people heavier? Will you keep your heart whole, or allow it to be pulled by too many glittering things? Will you read the law so that you remember you are only a man among your brothers? Or will you let the throne make you forget that? Solomon had wisdom, but wisdom does not automatically keep a heart faithful. He had the temple, but the temple could not replace obedience. He had silver and gold, but silver and gold could not make the kingdom lighter. He had many alliances, but alliances could not heal a divided heart. And after everything, what the Bible places before the listener is not only the story of a failed king, but a deeper truth when the heart of a leader drifts away from its center. Many others will have to walk on the slanted road he leaves behind. Night falls over Shechem, over Jerusalem, over the newly divided roads of Israel. The lamps in Rehoboam's palace may still be burning in the north. Jeroboam begins building his own power. The people return to their homes with stories they have not yet had time to understand. An age has closed, but its echo still moves across the valleys and the hills. If we listen in that stillness, it is as though we can hear again the sound of Ahijah's cloak being torn in his hands. That sound is no longer a distant sign. It has become reality. A kingdom once whole has separated. A warning once written in the law has passed through Solomon's life, through his divided heart, through the judgment, and finally entered history through the division of Israel. The story of this chapter does not end in complete peace, but in a deep silence. Solomon is dead. Rehoboam has chosen wrongly. Jeroboam has stepped into a new role. Israel has been torn in two. But above all those upheavals, the warning of Scripture still remains, like a voice that does not grow old with time. Do not let power make your heart heavy. Do not let silver and gold blind your eyes. Do not let alliances and compromises pull your heart away from what is sacred. Do not lift yourself above your brothers. And above all, do not forget that a kingdom can begin to collapse long before anyone sees its walls tremble. It can begin inside the heart of one human being, from a warning ignored, from a very small drifting, from a heart no longer whole as it was on the first day. And that is how the ancient warning was fulfilled after the death of Solomon. Not loudly from the beginning, not violently like a sudden storm, but slowly, sorrowfully, certainly like a crack moving through stone for many years, until the day the entire kingdom could no longer stand together on the same ground as before. And here, our journey tonight through the life of King Solomon slowly comes to an end. We began not with the palace, not with silver and gold, and not even with the number of 1,000 wives, but with a very ancient warning in the Bible, a warning that seemed to rest quietly upon the page. Yet through Solomon's life, it became a fearful mirror for every throne, every form of power, and every human heart. Solomon once asked for wisdom. He once stood before God with the humility of a young king, knowing that he could not rule that people by his own strength, He built the temple, made Jerusalem shine, and caused distant kingdoms to marvel at his wealth and understanding. But it was within that very light that darkness began to grow. War horses, chariots, silver and gold, foreign alliances, political marriages, high places, and strange altars. There was no sound of collapse in a single night. There were only very small steps away from the path, until the king's heart was no longer whole, and the kingdom after him was torn in two. The story of Solomon reminds us that a person can know what is right, can once love what is right, can once build great things, and still lose their center if they no longer remain watchful. If you are still listening in these final moments, thank you for walking with me tonight. Please subscribe to the channel and follow the fan page so you will not miss the next stories of the Bible, history, and legend. And leave me a comment to let me know. After Solomon, would you like to hear the story of Rehoboam, Jeroboam, King David, the Queen of Sheba, or another mysterious figure from the Bible?